I never thought the moment I would finally speak my truth would come between the cranberry sauce and my grandmother's famous apple pie. My name is Emma Johnson, and 3 weeks ago at our family's Christmas dinner, I said the words that would destroy my sister Victoria's political career, end my relationship with my parents, and finally set me free from a secret that had been suffocating me for 3 long years. What started as our usual holiday tradition in Denver turned into the night I revealed that Colorado's rising political star, my own sister, was one of the most corrupt politicians in state history. If you think family loyalty should trump everything else, you might want to stop watching now. But if you've ever been caught between doing what's easy and doing what's right, if you've ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and protecting people you'll never meet, then you need to hear this story. Because sometimes the people we're supposed to trust the most are the ones capable of the greatest betrayal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as Emma Johnson meant understanding from a very early age that I was destined to be the supporting character in someone else's story. Not the villain, not even the comic relief, just the reliable older sister who would fade into the background while Victoria Johnson, 18 months younger and infinitely more charismatic, claimed center stage. Our childhood home in the Highlands neighborhood of Denver was filled with participation trophies from my various academic competitions, science fair ribbons, and honor roll certificates. But if you asked any visitor what they remembered about the Johnson family, it would always be Victoria's latest achievement or her next ambitious goal. My parents, Robert and Linda Johnson, weren't cruel people, but they were practical ones. My father worked as a mid-level manager at a telecommunications company, and my mother taught elementary school, which meant we lived comfortably but without any real luxury. They recognized early on that Victoria possessed something special, a magnetic quality that drew people in and made them want to help her succeed. I possessed reliability, organization skills, and a sharp analytical mind that would serve me well in life, but I didn't light up rooms the way Victoria did from the time she could walk. I remember being 7 years old, sitting in the audience of Victoria's first school play where she played a tree in the kindergarten production of The Seasons. Somehow, even as a tree, she managed to steal every scene. Parents who didn't even know our family were asking my mother about that remarkable little girl and predicting she would do great things someday. I had played the lead in my own third-grade production just 2 months earlier, but no one seemed to remember that performance when Victoria took her bows. The pattern established itself early and never wavered. Victoria would dream big, my parents would figure out how to make those dreams financially possible, and I would help however I could while pursuing my own more modest ambitions. When Victoria announced in middle school that she wanted to be president someday, my parents didn't laugh or suggest she aim lower. They started researching the best high schools for future politicians, began attending local Democratic Party events to network, and slowly transformed our dinner table conversations into policy discussions that would prepare Victoria for her eventual career in public service. I found my own path through academics and writing. While Victoria was captivating student council meetings with speeches about improving cafeteria food and extending recess, I was quietly excelling in advanced placement courses and developing the research and analytical skills that would eventually lead me to journalism. My parents supported my achievements in their own way, attending parent-teacher conferences, where they would nod approvingly at my grades before asking if there were any leadership opportunities that might look good on Victoria's transcript. High school intensified everything. Victoria ran for class president 3 times and won twice, losing only her sophomore year to a senior boy, whose campaign she then managed the following year out of what she called strategic relationship building. She founded a volunteer organization that helped elderly residents with technology, started a peer tutoring program, and somehow maintained a social life that included dating the captain of the debate team and the editor of the school newspaper, though not simultaneously. She was prom queen, valedictorian, and accepted to Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, with a partial scholarship and enough family connections to secure internships that most students could only dream about. I graduated salutatorian, earned a full academic scholarship to Colorado State University, and planned to major in journalism with a focus on investigative reporting. My parents were proud, certainly, but their pride felt different than what they showed for Victoria. They were proud the way you might be proud of a reliable car that gets excellent gas mileage and never breaks down. Satisfied, grateful, but not particularly excited. Victoria's acceptance to Georgetown was celebrated with a dinner party for 30 people, including local Democratic Party officials who wanted to stay connected to her rising star. My full ride to CSU was acknowledged with a cake from the grocery store, and my father's comment that it was smart to stay close to home and save money. The financial difference in how our education was approached became more apparent as college progressed. While I worked 20 hours a week at the campus library to cover my living expenses and textbooks, my parents somehow found money to send Victoria on international study programs, unpaid internships in Washington, D.C., and networking events that required expensive professional wardrobes. I understood the investment strategy behind their choices, but understanding something intellectually doesn't always prevent it from hurting emotionally. Victoria thrived at Georgetown in ways that seemed almost inevitable. She double majored in government and international relations, spent a semester studying at Oxford, interned for 2 different senators, and graduated magna cum laude with a thesis on campaign finance reform that would later seem tragically ironic. She had job offers from 3 different political consulting firms, a fellowship with a nonprofit focused on voting rights, and admission to Georgetown's law school, though she deferred to gain real-world experience first. During those college years, despite the distance and our different trajectories, Victoria and I maintained a close relationship that was built on genuine affection and mutual respect. She would call me for advice about everything from roommate conflicts to whether she should accept certain internship opportunities. I became her unofficial research assistant and speechwriter, helping her prepare for debates, editing her papers, and even crafting talking points for her various campus leadership positions. She valued my analytical skills and ability to see potential problems before they developed, and I was genuinely proud to contribute to her success. Looking back now, I realize those college years were probably the last time our relationship was truly honest. Victoria wasn't yet operating in an environment where corruption was normalized, where ethical compromises were presented as political necessity. She genuinely believed in the causes she advocated for, the reforms she promoted, and the vision of public service she articulated in countless campus speeches. I believed in them too, which is why I was so willing to support her ambitions, even when it meant sacrificing time I could have spent building my own career. After graduation, Victoria moved back to Denver with a plan that was ambitious, even by her standards. Rather than working her way up through established political organizations, she wanted to build her own base of support and run for state legislature within 5 years. She rented a small apartment in Capitol Hill, took a job with a local nonprofit focused on affordable housing, and immediately began the networking and coalition building that would form the foundation of her political career. I had graduated from CSU with honors and landed an entry-level position at the Denver Tribune, one of the state's most respected newspapers. My starting salary was barely enough to cover rent on a studio apartment and student loan payments, but I was thrilled to be working in investigative journalism, even if most of my assignments involved fact-checking other reporters' work and researching background information for stories. I hoped that eventually I would get opportunities to write my own pieces, break important stories, and build the kind of career that would make me proud to look back on. Victoria's nonprofit work was legitimate and impressive. She helped coordinate a coalition that successfully opposed a zoning change that would have displaced low-income families, organized voter registration drives in underserved communities, and published research about housing discrimination that was cited in federal court cases. Her work earned attention from local media, including a profile piece in the Tribune that I had pitched to my editor and helped research, though I didn't write it since covering my own sister would have been an obvious conflict of interest. By her 3rd year back in Denver, Victoria had built enough of a reputation to consider running for office. The state Senate seat representing our district was held by a Republican who had won his last election by only 3 percentage points, making it a potentially winnable race for the right Democratic candidate. Victoria spent months meeting with party officials, potential donors, and community leaders to gauge support for a potential campaign. The response was overwhelmingly positive. At 25, she would be young for a state senator, but her combination of policy knowledge, community connections, and natural charisma made her an attractive candidate. When Victoria officially announced her candidacy, I was one of her first volunteers. I took vacation days to help with campaign events, spent weekends walking neighborhoods to distribute literature, and used my journalism background to help with media strategy and speechwriting. The campaign's message focused on affordable housing, education funding, and government transparency, issues that reflected Victoria's genuine policy priorities and resonated with voters across party lines. The early months of the campaign were exhilarating. Victoria was a natural candidate who connected easily with voters and handled media interviews with sophistication that belied her age. Endorsements came in from unions, environmental groups, and women's organizations. Fundraising exceeded expectations, with small-dollar donations pouring in from supporters who were excited about supporting a young candidate with fresh ideas and genuine passion for public service. I was so proud of my sister during those early campaign days. Watching her speak at town halls and candidate forums, seeing how voters responded to her vision for the future, feeling like I was part of something important and meaningful. I felt like all those years of being the supporting character had been worth it. Victoria was going to win, she was going to be an outstanding senator, and I had played a small but meaningful role in making it happen. What I didn't know then was that while I was helping Victoria build a campaign based on transparency and ethical government, she was already making the compromises that would eventually destroy everything we had worked to create. The candidate who spoke passionately about the corrupting influence of special interest money was quietly beginning to accept contributions from exactly those interests, routed through shell companies and fake grassroots organizations that disguised their true sources. The sister I had supported, advised, and believed in was learning to lie with the same skill she had once used to advocate for truth. And I, the investigative journalist who prided myself on asking tough questions and uncovering hidden connections, was too close to the story and too invested in the outcome to see what was happening right in front of me. That blindness would cost me more than I could have imagined, but it would also eventually give me the strength to do something I never thought I would be capable of. Because sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who teach us the hardest lessons about who we really are and what we're truly willing to sacrifice for our principles. Victoria's campaign gained momentum faster than anyone anticipated. What started as a grassroots effort with volunteers making calls from kitchen tables and hosting house parties evolved into a sophisticated political operation that impressed even seasoned Democratic operatives. The transformation happened gradually, so gradually that I didn't notice when the scrappy upstart campaign I had fallen in love with became something entirely different. The first sign should have been David Chen. Victoria hired him as campaign manager 6 months before the election, bringing him in from a successful congressional race in California, where he had managed an upset victory for a young, progressive candidate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David was everything Victoria needed: experienced, connected, and ruthlessly efficient. He arrived in Denver with a contact list that included major donors, political consultants, and media strategists who could elevate Victoria's campaign to a level that would ensure victory. I liked David initially. He was soft-spoken and thoughtful, the kind of person who listened carefully before offering opinions and who seemed genuinely committed to Victoria's policy platform. During our first meeting, he complimented the messaging work I had done for the early campaign, and suggested that my journalism background could be valuable for opposition research and media strategy. I felt validated and important, like my contributions were finally being recognized by someone who understood political campaigns at a professional level. David's first major change was expanding the campaign's fundraising operation. Victoria had been relying primarily on small-dollar donations and contributions from local supporters. But David explained that winning would require significantly more resources. The Republican incumbent had access to corporate PACs and wealthy donors who could fund negative advertising campaigns that would overwhelm any grassroots effort. To compete effectively, Victoria would need to tap into larger donor networks and develop relationships with contributors who could make substantial financial commitments. The transition felt natural and necessary. David organized donor events at upscale venues, where Victoria could meet potential supporters in settings that reflected her growing credibility as a candidate. These events were sophisticated affairs, with professional catering, carefully crafted guest lists, and presentation materials that positioned Victoria as a serious contender who deserved investment from people who expected results from their political contributions. I attended several of these early fundraising events, usually helping with logistics or serving as an additional contact point for donors who had questions about Victoria's policy positions. The conversations were substantive and encouraging. Donors wanted to know about Victoria's plans for affordable housing, her strategy for improving education funding, and her approach to environmental protection. They seemed genuinely interested in supporting a candidate who would fight for progressive values and bring fresh perspective to state government. What I didn't understand then was that David was conducting two parallel fundraising operations. The events I attended were legitimate gatherings of actual supporters who contributed money they had earned through legal means and who expected nothing more than effective representation in return for their donations. But David was simultaneously cultivating a different category of donors, contributors who had specific legislative interests and who expected specific outcomes in exchange for their financial support. Victoria's schedule became increasingly demanding as the campaign expanded. She was attending multiple events every day, meeting with various constituencies, and traveling throughout the district to build name recognition and voter support. I saw less of her during this period, but when we did talk, she seemed energized and optimistic. The polls showed her closing the gap with the incumbent, and political analysts were beginning to describe the race as competitive rather than a likely Republican hold. My role in the campaign evolved during this period. David asked me to take on opposition research responsibilities, using my journalism skills to investigate the incumbent's voting record, business relationships, and potential vulnerabilities. It was work I enjoyed and felt qualified to do. I spent hours reviewing public records, analyzing campaign finance reports, and identifying connections between the incumbent's policy positions and his major donors. The research revealed a pattern of votes that consistently favored corporate interests over constituent needs, providing Victoria with ammunition for debates and advertising campaigns. The opposition research also gave me insight into how political campaigns operate at a level one hadn't previously understood. Campaign finance reports revealed complex networks of contributors, PACs, and independent expenditure groups that made it difficult to trace the true sources of political money. I learned about shell companies that existed only to channel contributions, about donors who gave maximum amounts to multiple organizations supporting the same candidate, and about the various legal strategies campaigns use to work around contribution limits and disclosure requirements. This education in campaign finance should have prepared me to recognize similar patterns in Victoria's own fundraising operation. But I was too focused on using the information against her opponent to look critically at our own practices. I trusted Victoria and David to handle the fundraising ethically while I concentrated on the research and messaging work that I felt most qualified to contribute. The campaign's messaging became more sophisticated as David brought in professional consultants to handle advertising and media strategy. Victoria's early speeches, which I had helped write and which reflected her genuine policy priorities, were refined by specialists who understood how to craft language that would resonate with specific voter demographics. The core message remained consistent with Victoria's values, but the presentation became more polished and strategic. I was proud of how professional the campaign had become, but I also felt somewhat sidelined by the influx of paid staff who were more experienced than I was. My volunteer contributions were still valued, but they were no longer essential to the campaign's day-to-day operations. I continued attending events and helping with research, but I was no longer part of the inner circle that made strategic decisions about messaging, scheduling, and resource allocation. Victoria seemed to thrive in this more professional environment. She developed relationships with political operatives, union leaders, and community activists who could provide endorsements and volunteer support. Her public speaking improved noticeably as she gained experience and confidence, and her policy positions became more detailed and nuanced as she engaged with experts who could help her understand complex legislative issues. The campaign's success was evident in the increased attention Victoria received from local media and political observers. She was invited to participate in candidate forums, editorial board interviews, and televised debates that provided opportunities to contrast her vision with her opponent's record. She performed well in these settings. demonstrating knowledge, passion, and communication skills that impressed journalists and voters alike. By late summer, internal polling showed Victoria had taken a slight lead, and external observers were beginning to predict that she would win. The momentum was building in ways that made victory seem not just possible but likely. Victoria was being mentioned in statewide media as a rising star in the Democratic Party, someone who could potentially run for higher office if she proved herself as an effective state senator. The success felt surreal and wonderful. I had watched my sister transform from an ambitious young nonprofit worker into a legitimate political candidate who was on the verge of winning significant public office. I felt proud of the small role I had played in that transformation, and excited about what Victoria might accomplish as an elected official. The campaign had exceeded everyone's expectations, and election night was beginning to feel like a celebration rather than a nail-biting contest. What I couldn't see from my position outside the campaign's financial operations was that the success was built on a foundation that would eventually crumble. David's sophisticated fundraising operation had indeed attracted the resources necessary to win, but those resources came with obligations that Victoria was already beginning to fulfill in ways that contradicted everything she claimed to stand for publicly. The final months before the election brought a level of intensity to Victoria's campaign that felt both exhilarating and exhausting. Every day brought new endorsements, increased poll numbers, and growing confidence that we were on the verge of something historic. Victoria was poised to become one of the youngest state senators in Colorado history, and her victory would represent a significant shift in our district's political representation. The excitement was infectious, and I found myself caught up in the momentum despite my growing distance from the campaign's inner workings. Victoria's transformation during this period was remarkable to witness. The earnest nonprofit worker who had announced her candidacy 18 months earlier had evolved into a polished political candidate who could navigate complex policy discussions, handle hostile questions from reporters, and deliver speeches that moved audiences to action. She had developed the kind of presence that made people pay attention when she entered a room, and her confidence in her ability to serve effectively in office was evident in every public appearance. I was working longer hours at the Tribune during this time, having been promoted to a junior reporter position that gave me opportunities to write my own stories rather than just supporting other journalists' work. The promotion was validation of my skills and dedication, but it also meant that I had less time to volunteer for Victoria's campaign. I attended major events when possible and continued to help with research projects, but I was no longer as deeply involved in the day-to-day operations as I had been earlier. The distance between Victoria and me that had developed as her campaign became more professional continued to grow during these final months. She was surrounded by paid staff and political advisors who managed her schedule and controlled access to her time. When I did see her at family dinners or campaign events, she seemed distracted and focused on conversations that I wasn't part of. I understood that this was natural given the demands of a competitive political race, but it was the first time in our lives that I felt like Victoria was operating in a world that I couldn't access. My parents were completely absorbed in Victoria's campaign during this period. My father had taken vacation time to volunteer full-time during the final weeks, and my mother was hosting phone banks and fundraising events that turned our childhood home into an unofficial campaign headquarters. They were living their own political dreams through Victoria's candidacy, and their excitement about her prospects was the dominant topic of conversation at every family gathering. The financial strain of supporting Victoria's ambitions was becoming apparent to me, though my parents tried to hide it. I noticed that they had canceled their planned vacation, that my mother was driving an older car than she had been the previous year, and that their usual generous Christmas gifts had been scaled back. When I asked about it, they insisted that supporting Victoria's campaign was the best investment they could make in the family's future. But I worried about the sacrifices they were making for success that wasn't guaranteed. Victoria's opponent was running a more aggressive campaign as the election approached, and his own polls showed him trailing. The Republican incumbent had significant advantages in terms of name recognition and donor support, but he was struggling to articulate a compelling vision for his next term in office. His campaign strategy seemed to focus primarily on attacking Victoria's inexperience and questioning whether someone her age could effectively represent the district's interests in the state legislature. The negative attacks provided opportunities for Victoria to demonstrate her policy knowledge and commitment to the issues that mattered to voters. She handled the criticism skillfully, using debates and media interviews to pivot from defensive responses to proactive discussions of her plans for affordable housing, education funding, and economic development. Her ability to stay focused on substantive issues while under attack impressed observers and seemed to strengthen her position with undecided voters. I was proud of how Victoria handled the pressure and criticism that came with being a competitive candidate. The attacks on her age and experience were clearly attempts to undermine her credibility, but she responded with intelligence and grace that made her opponent's strategy seem petty and outdated. She was proving that young candidates could bring energy and fresh thinking to politics without sacrificing competence or effectiveness. The campaign's fundraising continued to exceed expectations throughout this period. David had succeeded in building a donor network that provided the resources necessary to compete with the incumbent's established funding base. Victoria was able to purchase television advertising, hire additional staff, and expand voter outreach efforts in ways that demonstrated the campaign's strength and viability. The financial success was particularly impressive, given that Victoria was challenging an incumbent who had institutional advantages and established relationships with major contributors. What I didn't understand then was the true nature of the fundraising success that was making Victoria's campaign so competitive. The legitimate donors I had met at early campaign events were indeed contributing significant amounts, but their contributions were being supplemented by much larger sums, from sources that had very specific expectations about how Victoria would vote on particular issues if elected. David had identified corporations and lobbying groups that had legislative interests pending before the state Senate and had quietly approached them about supporting Victoria's campaign in exchange for commitments about her future voting behavior. These arrangements were structured to avoid direct quid pro quo relationships that would be obviously illegal, but they established clear understandings about what Victoria's donors expected in return for their financial support. The energy development industry was particularly interested in Victoria's race, because several bills related to environmental regulation and drilling permits were likely to come before the Senate during the next legislative session. Traditional environmental groups supported Victoria because of her public positions on climate change and renewable energy, but fossil fuel companies were simultaneously contributing to her campaign through shell organizations because David had assured them that Victoria would be pragmatic about energy policy and supportive of compromise solutions that protected jobs while addressing environmental concerns. Similarly, healthcare industry representatives were contributing to Victoria's campaign while she was publicly advocating for increased regulation of pharmaceutical companies and expanded access to affordable healthcare. The apparent contradiction was resolved through carefully worded commitments that Victoria would support on healthcare providers and pharmaceutical companies. The real estate development industry had perhaps the most direct interest in Victoria's campaign, given her background in affordable housing advocacy. Developers who had opposed her nonprofit work were quietly contributing to her political campaign, because David had convinced them that Victoria understood the importance of balancing housing affordability with property rights and development opportunities. These arrangements were structured carefully to maintain plausible deniability for everyone involved. Campaign finance laws required disclosure of contributor information, but the money was routed through organizations with names like Colorado Families for Economic Growth and Working People for Responsible Government that disguised the true sources of the contributions. Victoria could honestly say that her campaign was supported by organizations focused on economic development and working families, without acknowledging that those organizations were funded by the very corporate interests she was publicly criticizing. I was completely unaware of these arrangements during the campaign. When I looked at Victoria's campaign finance reports, which were public records, I saw contributions from organizations that seemed aligned with her stated values and policy positions. I didn't have the time or resources to research the funding sources behind every contributing organization, and I trusted that Victoria and David were operating ethically and in accordance with campaign finance laws. My focus during this period was on my own career development and the excitement of potentially having a sister in the state legislature. I was writing more substantial stories for the Tribune, building relationships with sources, and developing expertise in areas that I hoped would lead to opportunities for investigative reporting. The idea that I might eventually need to investigate my own sister's political activities never occurred to me because I had no reason to suspect that anything inappropriate was happening. The final weeks of the campaign brought a level of intensity and optimism that made victory feel inevitable. Victoria's internal polls showed her with a consistent lead, and political observers were beginning to treat her election as a foregone conclusion. The campaign scheduled election night celebration at a downtown hotel, and invitations were sent to supporters, donors, and political figures who wanted to be associated with Victoria's success. I was looking forward to election night as a celebration of everything Victoria had accomplished and everything our family had sacrificed to support her political ambitions. The idea that the victory would be tainted by corruption that would eventually destroy Victoria's career and tear our family apart was unimaginable to me then. I believed in Victoria's integrity, trusted her commitment to the values she had campaigned on, and felt proud to be associated with her success. Election night arrived with the kind of crisp November energy that makes everything feel possible. The campaign had rented the ballroom at the Marriott downtown, and by 7 o'clock the space was filled with supporters, volunteers, and local Democratic officials who had come to celebrate what everyone expected would be Victoria's victory. The early returns were promising, showing Victoria with a substantial lead that grew larger as results came in from precincts throughout the district. I arrived at the election night party, feeling a mixture of excitement and relief. The campaign that had consumed so much of our family's time, energy, and resources over the past 18 months was finally coming to an end, and all signs pointed to the outcome we had hoped for. Victoria looked radiant in a navy blue dress that conveyed both professionalism and approachability, and she moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who knew she was about to achieve something significant. My parents were in their element at the election night celebration. After months of making phone calls, hosting events, and promoting Victoria's candidacy to anyone who would listen, they were finally able to enjoy the recognition that came with having raised a daughter who was about to become an elected official. Local Democratic Party leaders made a point of congratulating them on Victoria's success, and several people mentioned that they hoped Victoria would consider running for higher office in the future. David Chen was managing the evening with his characteristic efficiency, coordinating with the media, updating supporters on incoming results, and preparing for Victoria's victory speech. He seemed pleased but not surprised by the results, as if the outcome had been predetermined by the quality of the campaign operation he had built. When reporters asked him about the keys to Victoria's success, he emphasized her message, her work ethic, and her ability to connect with voters across traditional party lines. The victory speech that Victoria delivered that night was one of the best I had ever heard her give. She thanked the volunteers who had made the campaign possible, acknowledged the trust that voters had placed in her, and outlined her priorities for representing the district in the state legislature. She spoke about affordable housing, education funding, and government transparency with passion and specificity that demonstrated her readiness to serve effectively in office. Watching Victoria speak to the crowd that night, I felt overwhelmed with pride and optimism about what she would accomplish as an elected official. She had run a campaign based on substantive policy proposals and ethical governance, and her victory represented a mandate for the kind of progressive leadership that I believed our state needed. I was excited to see how she would translate her campaign promises into legislative action and policy results that would improve people's lives. The celebration continued late into the night, with supporters sharing stories about their involvement in the campaign and expressing excitement about Victoria's future in politics. Several people mentioned that they hoped Victoria would run for Congress or statewide office eventually, and there was a sense that her election to the state Senate was just the beginning of a political career that could take her anywhere she wanted to go. I left the election night party feeling exhausted but happy, proud of what Victoria had accomplished, and excited about what she would do with the opportunity that voters had given her. The campaign had been a long and demanding process, but the outcome made all the sacrifices and hard work feel worthwhile. Victoria was going to be a state senator, and I had played a small but meaningful role in making that possible. The weeks following the election brought a flood of congratulations, media attention, and requests for interviews that reflected the significance of Victoria's victory. She was featured in newspaper profiles, invited to speak at Democratic Party events, and asked to provide commentary on political issues that would be addressed during the upcoming legislative session. The attention was gratifying and seemed to validate the investment of time and resources that had made her campaign successful. Victoria's transition to elected office began immediately after the election. She hired staff members, rented office space, and started meeting with lobbyists, interest groups, and constituent organizations to understand the issues that would require her attention once the legislative session began. The transition process was complex and demanding, but Victoria approached it with the same energy and attention to detail that had characterized her campaign. I was working on a series of articles about the election results and their implications for state politics, which gave me opportunities to observe Victoria's transition process from a professional perspective. The articles I was writing focused on the broader political trends that the election represented, but covering the aftermath of Victoria's victory allowed me to see how seriously she was taking her new responsibilities and how well prepared she was to serve effectively in office. My first indication that something might be problematic with Victoria's campaign came about 6 weeks after the election, when I was reviewing campaign finance reports for a story about fundraising patterns in local races. Victoria's final campaign finance report showed contributions from several organizations that I didn't recognize, and when I researched their backgrounds, I discovered that they were affiliated with industries and interest groups that seemed inconsistent with Victoria's campaign messaging. The discovery was puzzling, rather than alarming at first. Campaign finance laws are complex, and it's common for organizations to have names that don't clearly indicate their true purposes or funding sources. I assumed that there were reasonable explanations for the contributions that would make sense once I understood the context better. Victoria had run an ethical campaign focused on transparency and accountability, so the idea that there might be anything inappropriate about her fundraising seemed unlikely. I decided to ask Victoria about the contributions directly, rather than investigating them further on my own. We were having lunch together a few days before Christmas, and I brought up the campaign finance report in what I intended to be a casual conversation about the administrative details of closing out a political campaign. I mentioned that I had noticed some unfamiliar organizations among her contributors and asked if she could explain their backgrounds and why they had supported her candidacy. Victoria's reaction to my questions was immediate and defensive in a way that surprised me. She became visibly uncomfortable and said that campaign fundraising was complex and that not all contributors were familiar to candidates personally. When I pressed for more specific information about the organizations I had identified, she said that David had handled most of the fundraising details and that she would need to check with him before providing explanations about specific contributors. The conversation left me with an uneasy feeling that I couldn't quite identify. Victoria had always been open and forthcoming about her political activities, and her reluctance to discuss the campaign finance details seemed out of character. I told myself that she was probably just tired from the demands of transitioning to office, and that my questions had come across as more accusatory than I had intended. A few days later, David called me to follow up on my conversation with Victoria. He explained that the organizations I had asked about were legitimate political action committees that supported candidates who shared their policy priorities. He provided general information about their focus areas and assured me that all of Victoria's campaign contributions had been received and reported in accordance with applicable laws and regulations. David's explanations were plausible and professional, but they didn't address my specific questions about why organizations focused on energy development and healthcare industry interests would support a candidate who had campaigned on environmental protection and healthcare reform. When I asked about this apparent contradiction, David said that Victoria's positions were more nuanced than her campaign messaging had suggested, and that she was committed to evidence-based policies that balanced competing interests and priorities. The conversation with David was courteous but unsatisfying. I felt like I was being managed rather than informed, and David's explanations raised more questions than they answered. I began to wonder whether there were aspects of Victoria's campaign that I hadn't been aware of, and whether her victory had come at costs that weren't apparent from my position outside the campaign's financial operations. Over the following weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to Victoria's public statements and policy positions as she prepared for the legislative session. Her comments about energy policy and healthcare regulation seemed more cautious and qualified than they had been during the campaign, and she was using language that suggested she might be more open to compromise than her campaign messaging had indicated. The changes were subtle, and they could have been explained by the realities of governing rather than campaigning. Elected officials often find that their policy positions must be more pragmatic and flexible than campaign promises suggest. And Victoria's evolution could have been a natural response to the complexities of legislative work rather than evidence of anything problematic. But the combination of the unexplained campaign contributions, Victoria's defensive reaction to my questions, and her increasingly cautious public statements created a pattern that my journalistic training taught me to recognize as potentially significant. I didn't yet suspect corruption or deliberate deception, but I was beginning to wonder whether Victoria's political success had involved compromises that she wasn't comfortable discussing publicly. The Colorado legislative session began in January with the kind of ceremonial pageantry that makes democratic government feel both important and hopeful. Victoria was sworn in as one of the youngest members of the state Senate, and the local media coverage emphasized her historic achievement and the fresh perspective she would bring to legislative deliberations. I attended the swearing-in ceremony with my parents, feeling proud of Victoria's accomplishment and optimistic about what she would achieve during her first term in office. Victoria's first weeks as a state senator seemed to validate all the positive expectations that had surrounded her election. She was appointed to committees that aligned with her campaign priorities, including housing and urban affairs, education, and government accountability. Her early speeches on the Senate floor demonstrated knowledge and passion that impressed both Democratic colleagues and political observers, who were watching to see how she would handle the transition from candidate to legislator. The media attention that Victoria received during her early months in office was overwhelmingly positive. She was featured in profiles that portrayed her as a rising star in the Democratic Party, someone who could potentially run for higher office if she proved herself as an effective state senator. National political commentators mentioned her as an example of the young, diverse candidates who were changing the face of American politics and bringing new energy to progressive causes. I was covering some aspects of the legislative session for the Tribune, though I avoided writing directly about Victoria's activities to prevent any appearance of conflict of interest. My editors understood the ethical complications of having a family member in the legislature, and they assigned other reporters to cover stories that involved Victoria directly. However, my background knowledge of her campaign and policy positions made me a useful resource for colleagues who were writing about broader legislative trends and developments. During this period, I was developing my skills as an investigative reporter by working on stories about campaign finance patterns, lobbying activities, and the relationships between political contributors and legislative outcomes. The work was intellectually challenging and professionally rewarding, and it was giving me expertise in areas that would eventually become central to my career. I was learning to identify the signs of potential corruption, to trace money through complex organizational structures, and to understand how special interests influence the legislative process. The irony of developing this expertise while my own sister was potentially engaged in the very practices I was learning to investigate would become apparent later, but at the time I saw my work as completely separate from Victoria's political career. I trusted that Victoria was operating ethically, and that her legislative activities were guided by the principles she had campaigned on, rather than by obligations to contributors or special interests. Victoria's first major legislative initiative was a bill related to affordable housing that reflected her campaign promises and her background in nonprofit work. The bill proposed tax incentives for developers who included affordable units in new construction projects, along with increased funding for housing assistance programs that would help low-income families access stable housing. The proposal was consistent with Victoria's established policy priorities and seemed to demonstrate her commitment to translating campaign promises into legislative action. The housing bill received support from advocacy organizations and progressive legislators who had been pushing for increased attention to affordable housing issues. Victoria's leadership on the issue was praised by editorial writers and policy experts who saw the bill as a thoughtful approach to addressing housing affordability without imposing unrealistic mandates on developers or creating unsustainable fiscal obligations for the state. However, as I followed the bill's progress through the legislative process, I began to notice aspects of its development that seemed inconsistent with Victoria's campaign messaging. The tax incentives included in the bill were more generous than what affordable housing advocates had requested, and the affordable housing requirements were less stringent than what Victoria had proposed during her campaign. The changes made the bill more palatable to real estate developers, but less effective at actually increasing affordable housing availability. When I asked Victoria about the modifications to her original proposal, she explained that legislative compromise was necessary to build the broad coalition needed to pass meaningful legislation. She said that the bill as written represented the best outcome that was politically feasible, and that incremental progress was better than no progress at all. Her explanation was reasonable and reflected a realistic understanding of how legislation is developed and passed. But the pattern of moderation and compromise that characterized Victoria's housing bill was repeated in other legislative initiatives she supported during her first session. An education funding bill that she co-sponsored included provisions that benefited private schools more than Victoria had suggested during her campaign. A healthcare transparency measure that she promoted was weaker than what consumer advocacy groups had requested and stronger than what healthcare industry representatives had opposed. The cumulative effect of these compromises was legislation that was less progressive and less challenging to established interests than Victoria's campaign messaging had suggested it would be. The changes weren't dramatic enough to represent a complete betrayal of her campaign promises, but they were significant enough to suggest that her governing philosophy was more centrist than her campaign rhetoric had indicated. I found myself wondering whether Victoria's approach to legislation was influenced by the contributions she had received from organizations representing the very industries that were benefiting from her moderate positions. The connection wasn't direct or obvious enough to represent clear evidence of corruption, but the pattern was concerning to someone who had expected Victoria to be a more aggressive advocate for progressive causes. My concerns about Victoria's legislative activities were reinforced by changes in her personal behavior and communication style. She was less accessible than she had been during the campaign, and our conversations about politics became more guarded and formal. When I asked her about specific bills or policy decisions, she would provide talking points that sounded like they had been developed by professional communications staff rather than expressing her personal views and reasoning. Victoria was also spending more time with lobbyists and interest group representatives than I had expected. While meeting with stakeholders is a normal part of legislative work, Victoria seemed to be developing particularly close relationships with representatives of industries that had traditionally opposed the kind of policies she had campaigned on. When I asked her about these relationships, she said that effective legislation required input from all affected parties, and that she was committed to evidence-based policymaking rather than ideological positions. The explanation was reasonable, but it represented a significant change from the Victoria who had campaigned on fighting special interests and prioritizing ordinary people's needs over corporate profits. The transformation wasn't complete or absolute, but it was noticeable enough to concern me and to raise questions about whether Victoria's political success was changing her in ways that she hadn't anticipated. My growing unease about Victoria's legislative activities was complicated by my recognition that I might be holding her to unrealistic standards or expecting her to maintain campaign-level passion for every policy position throughout the practical work of governing. Newly elected officials often find that their idealistic campaign promises must be adjusted to accommodate political realities and competing priorities. Victoria's evolution could have been a natural and appropriate response to the responsibilities of office, rather than evidence of ethical compromise. Additionally, Victoria was clearly succeeding by conventional political measures. She was well regarded by colleagues, effective at building coalitions, and increasingly mentioned as a potential candidate for higher office. Her approval ratings among constituents were strong, and she was receiving invitations to speak at political events throughout the state. If her approach to legislation was problematic, it wasn't obvious to most observers or reflected in her political standing. But my journalistic training had taught me to pay attention to patterns and to investigate discrepancies between public statements and actual behavior. The combination of unexplained campaign contributions, increasingly moderate policy positions, and Victoria's defensive reactions to my questions created a pattern that seemed worth understanding better. I wasn't yet ready to investigate Victoria directly, but I was beginning to think that there might be aspects of her political career that deserved closer scrutiny. The decision that would eventually change everything came when I received a phone call from someone who identified himself only as a concerned citizen who had information about corruption in state government. The caller said that he had evidence of illegal campaign contributions and quid pro quo arrangements involving multiple legislators, including some who were considered rising stars in the Democratic Party. He said that he was willing to share the evidence with a journalist who was capable of investigating the story thoroughly and responsibly. I was interested in the story because political corruption was exactly the kind of investigative reporting I wanted to specialize in, and because exposing corruption was an important public service that could help protect democratic institutions. I agreed to meet with the source to review the evidence and determine whether it warranted further investigation. What I didn't know was that the evidence would include detailed documentation of Victoria's involvement in a corruption scheme that was far more extensive and systematic than anything I had imagined possible. The phone call that I took as a routine tip from a potential source was actually the beginning of the most difficult investigation of my career, and the end of the relationship with my sister that had defined my entire life. The coffee shop on 16th Street was busy enough to provide cover for a confidential meeting, but not so crowded that our conversation would be overheard by curious strangers. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table that offered clear sight lines to the entrance and exits, a habit I had developed while working on sensitive stories that required protecting source identities. The man who had called me 3 days earlier had agreed to meet, but he had insisted on anonymity and provided only minimal details about the evidence he claimed to possess. Marcus Thompson turned out to be nothing like what I had expected from our brief phone conversation. Instead of the nervous whistleblower or disgruntled political operative I had imagined, he was a well-dressed man in his 50s who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with complex situations. He introduced himself as a former legislative aide who had worked for multiple state senators over the past decade, and who had become increasingly concerned about corruption patterns he had observed in recent years. Marcus explained that his decision to contact me was motivated by his belief that the public deserved to know about systematic corruption that was undermining democratic institutions and betraying voter trust. He had witnessed arrangements between legislators and special interests that violated both the letter and spirit of campaign finance laws, and he had documented evidence that could expose the scope of the problem. His decision to approach me specifically was based on my growing reputation as an investigative reporter who could handle complex political stories with accuracy and professionalism. The evidence that Marcus presented was more extensive and detailed than anything I had encountered in my previous investigative work. He had compiled financial records, email communications, recorded phone conversations, and internal memoranda that documented a network of illegal campaign contributions and quid pro quo arrangements involving multiple legislators from both political parties. The sophistication of the corruption scheme was impressive in its scope and disturbing in its implications for democratic governance. According to Marcus, the corruption network operated through a complex system of shell organizations that disguised the true sources of political contributions, while ensuring that contributors received specific legislative outcomes in return for their financial support. The system allowed corporations and special interests to effectively purchase votes on key legislation while maintaining plausible deniability for all parties involved. The arrangements were structured to avoid obvious legal violations, while achieving the same practical results as direct bribery. The energy industry was a major participant in the corruption network, using multiple shell organizations to contribute to candidates who would support favorable regulatory decisions and oppose environmental restrictions that might limit drilling or mining activities. Healthcare companies were similarly involved, channeling money to legislators who would vote against pharmaceutical regulations and support policies that benefited insurance companies and healthcare providers at the expense of consumers and patients. Real estate developers and construction companies had developed particularly sophisticated methods for influencing housing and zoning legislation through contributions that were routed through organizations with names like Colorado Families for Affordable Housing and Working Communities Alliance. These organizations claim to advocate for affordable housing and economic development, while actually serving the interests of developers who wanted to minimize regulatory restrictions and maximize profit opportunities. The evidence Marcus presented included detailed financial records showing how money flowed from corporate sources through multiple shell organizations before reaching candidate campaign accounts. The paper trail was complex but traceable for anyone willing to invest the time and effort necessary to follow the money through its various transformations. The documentation revealed a level of coordination and planning that suggested the corruption network had been operating for years, with minimal risk of detection or prosecution. What made Marcus's evidence particularly compelling was his inclusion of recorded conversations and email communications that demonstrated explicit agreements between contributors and legislators about specific voting commitments and policy outcomes. The recordings captured politicians discussing which votes they would deliver in exchange for financial support, and the emails documented follow-up communications that confirmed the arrangements and tracked their implementation over time. As I reviewed the evidence, I felt a mixture of excitement about the potential significance of the story and concern about the implications for democratic institutions if the corruption was as widespread as Marcus suggested. The story had the potential to be career-defining work that could expose systematic abuse of public trust and lead to meaningful reforms in campaign finance practices and ethics enforcement. However, investigating and reporting on such extensive corruption would require months of additional research and verification work. Marcus explained that his decision to compile the evidence had been motivated by his growing disgust with a system that allowed wealthy interests to purchase legislative outcomes, while ordinary citizens were excluded from meaningful participation in democratic processes. He had spent months gathering documentation and verifying information before deciding to approach a journalist who could investigate the story thoroughly and present it to the public in a way that would generate appropriate attention and response. The evidence package that Marcus provided included a summary document that identified specific legislators who were allegedly involved in the corruption network, along with details about the amounts of money they had received and the legislative actions they had taken in return. The summary was organized by policy area, showing how different industries had targeted particular committees and legislators who had jurisdiction over issues that affected their business interests. When I saw Victoria's name on the summary document, my initial reaction was relief rather than concern. Marcus had identified her as having received contributions from energy and real estate interests, but the amounts were relatively modest compared to some other legislators, and the summary suggested that her involvement might be limited or peripheral, rather than central to the corruption network. I assumed that any connections between Victoria and the corruption scheme would be easily explained or disproven once I began investigating the allegations more thoroughly. Marcus noticed my reaction when I reached the section of the summary that mentioned Victoria, and he asked whether I had any personal connections to the legislators who were identified in his evidence. I explained that Victoria was my sister, but that I was confident in my ability to investigate the allegations objectively and report on whatever I discovered without bias or favoritism. I emphasized that my commitment to journalistic integrity would prevent me from protecting anyone, including family members, if the evidence supported allegations of corruption. The conversation with Marcus lasted nearly 3 hours as we reviewed the evidence in detail and discussed the methodology I would use to investigate and verify the information he had provided. He stressed the importance of protecting his identity and ensuring that his role as a source would not be revealed to anyone who might retaliate against him for exposing the corruption network. I assured him that I understood the risks he was taking, and that I would follow established journalistic practices to protect his anonymity while using his evidence responsibly. Marcus also provided me with contact information for additional sources who could verify specific aspects of the corruption scheme and help me understand the context and implications of the evidence he had compiled. These sources included current and former legislative staff members, lobbyists who had witnessed the arrangements firsthand, and business representatives who had participated in or been approached about contributing to the corruption network. After Marcus left the coffee shop, I sat alone for nearly an hour processing what I had learned and considering the implications for my career, my family, and my relationship with Victoria. The evidence he had provided was serious enough to warrant thorough investigation, but I was already dreading the possibility that the investigation might confirm Victoria's involvement in activities that would destroy her political career and devastate our family relationships. I decided that my responsibility as a journalist required me to investigate the allegations, regardless of their potential impact on my personal relationships. The public interest in exposing political corruption outweighed any obligation I might feel to protect Victoria from scrutiny, especially since I still believed that the investigation would likely clear her of any serious wrongdoing. I convinced myself that investigating the allegations would actually help Victoria by providing an opportunity to address any misunderstandings or explain any appearances of impropriety. Over the following days, I began the painstaking process of verifying Marcus's evidence and developing additional sources who could provide context and confirmation for the allegations he had made. The work was methodical and time-consuming, requiring careful analysis of financial records, interview preparation, and coordination with editors who needed to understand the scope and significance of the investigation I was undertaking. The more I learned about the corruption network that Marcus had exposed, the more concerned I became about its implications for democratic governance and public trust. The systematic nature of the arrangements suggested that corruption had become normalized and institutionalized, rather than representing isolated incidents of individual misconduct. The evidence pointed to a culture of corruption that undermined the integrity of the entire legislative process. My investigation into the corruption allegations consumed the next several weeks as I worked to verify Marcus's evidence and develop additional sources who could provide insight into the scope and operations of the network he had exposed. The work required a level of discretion and methodical analysis that was new to my experience as a journalist, and I found myself developing expertise in financial forensics and investigative techniques that would serve me throughout my career. The first phase of my investigation focused on tracing the financial transactions that Marcus had documented to confirm their accuracy and understand their significance. Campaign finance records are public documents, but the complexity of the transactions Marcus had identified required sophisticated analysis to understand how money had been moved through multiple organizations before reaching candidate campaign accounts. I spent hours reviewing corporate filings, tax records, and regulatory documents to understand the true ownership and control structures of the shell organizations involved in the corruption scheme. The financial analysis confirmed that Marcus's evidence was accurate and comprehensive. The shell organizations he had identified were indeed controlled by representatives of the industries he had specified, and the money they contributed to political campaigns was ultimately sourced from corporate interests that had specific legislative priorities. The paper trail was complex but undeniable once I understood how to trace the connections between the various organizations and their ultimate funding sources. I also began conducting interviews with sources who could provide additional insight into how the corruption network operated and who was involved in its activities. The campaign's fundraising continued to exceed expectations throughout this period. David had succeeded in building a donor network that provided the resources necessary to compete with the incumbent's established funding base. Victoria was able to purchase television advertising, hire additional staff, and expand voter outreach efforts in ways that demonstrated the campaign's strength and viability. The financial success was particularly impressive, given that Victoria was challenging an incumbent who had institutional advantages and established relationships with major contributors. What I didn't understand then was the true nature of the fundraising success that was making Victoria's campaign so competitive. The legitimate donors I had met at early campaign events were indeed contributing significant amounts, but their contributions were being supplemented by much larger sums from sources that had very specific expectations about how Victoria would vote on particular issues if elected. David had identified corporations and lobbying groups that had legislative interests pending before the state Senate and had quietly approached them about supporting Victoria's campaign in exchange for commitments about her future voting behavior. These arrangements were structured to avoid direct quid pro quo relationships that would be obviously illegal, but they established clear understandings about what Victoria's donors expected in return for their financial support. The energy development industry was particularly interested in Victoria's race, because several bills related to environmental regulation and drilling permits were likely to come before the Senate during the next legislative session. Traditional environmental groups supported Victoria because of her public positions on climate change and renewable energy, But fossil fuel companies were simultaneously contributing to her campaign through shell organizations because David had assured them that Victoria would be pragmatic about energy policy and supportive of compromise solutions that protected jobs while addressing environmental concerns. Similarly, healthcare industry representatives were contributing to Victoria's campaign while she was publicly advocating for increased regulation of pharmaceutical companies and expanded access to affordable healthcare. The apparent contradiction was resolved through carefully worded commitments that Victoria would support on healthcare providers and pharmaceutical companies. The real estate development industry had perhaps the most direct interest in Victoria's campaign, given her background in affordable housing advocacy. Developers who had opposed her nonprofit work were quietly contributing to her political campaign, because David had convinced them that Victoria understood the importance of balancing housing affordability with property rights and development opportunities. These arrangements were structured carefully to maintain plausible deniability for everyone involved. Campaign finance laws required disclosure of contributor information, but the money was routed through organizations with names like Colorado Families for Economic Growth and Working People for Responsible Government that disguised the true sources of the contributions. Victoria could honestly say that her campaign was supported by organizations focused on economic development and working families, without acknowledging that those organizations were funded by the very corporate interests she was publicly criticizing. I was completely unaware of these arrangements during the campaign. When I looked at Victoria's campaign finance reports, which were public records, I saw contributions from organizations that seemed aligned with her stated values and policy positions. I didn't have the time or resources to research the funding sources behind every contributing organization. And I trusted that Victoria and David were operating ethically and in accordance with campaign finance laws. My focus during this period was on my own career development and the excitement of potentially having a sister in the state legislature. I was writing more substantial stories for the Tribune, building relationships with sources, and developing expertise in areas that I hoped would lead to opportunities for investigative reporting. The idea that I might eventually need to investigate my own sister's political activities never occurred to me because I had no reason to suspect that anything inappropriate was happening. The final weeks of the campaign brought a level of intensity and optimism that made victory feel inevitable. Victoria's internal polls showed her with a consistent lead, and political observers were beginning to treat her election as a foregone conclusion. The campaign's scheduled election night celebration at a downtown hotel, and invitations were sent to supporters, donors, and political figures who wanted to be associated with Victoria's success. I was looking forward to election night as a celebration of everything Victoria had accomplished and everything our family had sacrificed to support her political ambitions. The idea that the victory would be tainted by corruption that would eventually destroy Victoria's career and tear our family apart was unimaginable to me then. I believed in Victoria's integrity, trusted her commitment to the values she had campaigned on, and felt proud to be associated with her success. Election night arrived with the kind of crisp November energy that makes everything feel possible. The campaign had rented the ballroom at the Marriott downtown, and by 7 o'clock the space was filled with supporters, volunteers, and local Democratic officials who had come to celebrate what everyone expected would be Victoria's victory. The early returns were promising, showing Victoria with a substantial lead that grew larger as results came in from precincts throughout the district. I arrived at the election night party, feeling a mixture of excitement and relief. The campaign that had consumed so much of our family's time, energy, and resources over the past 18 months was finally coming to an end, and all signs pointed to the outcome we had hoped for. Victoria looked radiant in a navy blue dress that conveyed both professionalism and approachability, and she moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who knew she was about to achieve something significant. My parents were in their element at the election night celebration. After months of making phone calls, hosting events, and promoting Victoria's candidacy to anyone who would listen, they were finally able to enjoy the recognition that came with having raised a daughter who was about to become an elected official. Local Democratic Party leaders made a point of congratulating them on Victoria's success, and several people mentioned that they hoped Victoria would consider running for higher office in the future. David Chen was managing the evening with his characteristic efficiency, coordinating with the media, updating supporters on incoming results, and preparing for Victoria's victory speech. He seemed pleased but not surprised by the results, as if the outcome had been predetermined by the quality of the campaign operation he had built. When reporters asked him about the keys to Victoria's success, he emphasized her message, her work ethic, and her ability to connect with voters across traditional party lines. The victory speech that Victoria delivered that night was one of the best I had ever heard her give. The decision about how to proceed with my investigation reached a critical point when I realized that I had gathered sufficient evidence to prove Victoria's involvement in the corruption network beyond any reasonable doubt. The documentation was comprehensive, the sources were credible, and the implications were clear and significant. I could no longer pretend that the investigation might clear Victoria of wrongdoing, or that there might be innocent explanations for the evidence I had discovered. I spent several sleepless nights considering my options and their consequences. I could publish the story immediately, which would expose the corruption network and fulfill my obligations as a journalist, but would also destroy Victoria's career and devastate my family relationships. Alternatively, I could give Victoria an opportunity to respond to the allegations before publication, which might allow her to explain her actions or take responsibility for her mistakes, but could also provide her with time to develop strategies for minimizing the damage or discrediting my reporting. I ultimately decided that journalistic ethics and fairness required me to give Victoria an opportunity to respond to the allegations before I published the story. While I was confident in the accuracy of my reporting, providing her with a chance to address the evidence would ensure that my story was as complete and balanced as possible. I also hoped that confronting Victoria directly might provide additional insight into her motivations and decision-making that would help readers understand how the corruption had developed and what it revealed about the broader political system. Arranging a meeting with Victoria proved more difficult than I had anticipated. Her schedule as a state senator was demanding, and she was increasingly surrounded by staff members who managed her time and controlled access to her attention. When I called her office and requested a meeting to discuss a story I was working on, her scheduler initially offered only a brief phone conversation that would not have provided adequate time for the serious discussion I needed to have with her. I eventually contacted Victoria directly through her personal phone number and explained that I needed to speak with her about a matter that was too sensitive and important to discuss over the phone or in a brief meeting. I emphasized that the conversation would be confidential and that I was reaching out to her as a family member rather than just as a journalist, though I made clear that I was working on a story that would require her input and response. Victoria agreed to meet me for dinner at a restaurant in downtown Denver that was far enough from the capital and her usual haunts to provide privacy for a confidential conversation. I chose a quiet establishment where we could talk without being overheard by other diners or recognized by political associates who might wonder about the nature of our discussion. The setting would allow for the kind of serious, extended conversation that the situation required. I arrived at the restaurant early and chose a corner table that would provide maximum privacy while still allowing for natural conversation. I had prepared extensively for the meeting, organizing my evidence and planning my approach to ensure that I presented the allegations clearly and fairly while giving Victoria adequate opportunity to respond. The conversation would be among the most difficult of my life, but it was necessary for both journalistic and personal reasons. Victoria arrived looking tired and stressed, which I attributed initially to the demands of her legislative responsibilities and the pressure of her first term in office. She seemed pleased to see me and made casual conversation about family matters and my work at the Tribune before settling into what she clearly expected would be a pleasant dinner with her sister. Her demeanor suggested that she had no anticipation of the serious discussion I was about to initiate. I began the conversation by explaining that I was working on an investigative story about political corruption in state government, and that my research had uncovered evidence of systematic arrangements between legislators and special interests that violated campaign finance laws and ethical standards. I emphasized that I was committed to reporting the story accurately and fairly, but that I needed to give everyone involved an opportunity to respond to the allegations before publication. Victoria's initial reaction was professional curiosity about the story, rather than personal concern about its implications for her own career. She asked intelligent questions about the scope of my investigation, the sources I had developed, and the timeline for publication. Her questions suggested that she was thinking about the story from the perspective of an elected official who might be asked to comment on political corruption, rather than as someone who might be personally implicated in the activities I was investigating. When I explained that the evidence I had gathered included documentation of her own involvement in the corruption network, Victoria's demeanor changed immediately and dramatically. The professional curiosity was replaced by alarm, then anger, then a defensive posture that suggested she was already thinking about damage control strategies, rather than honest acknowledgement of her activities. Her reaction confirmed that she was fully aware of her participation in the corruption scheme and understood the implications of exposure. Victoria's first strategy was to deny the allegations entirely and question the credibility of my sources and evidence. She suggested that disgruntled former employees or political opponents might have fabricated documentation or mischaracterized legitimate political activities as corruption. She argued that campaign finance laws were complex and that apparent violations might actually be technical issues that could be explained by experienced legal counsel rather than evidence of intentional wrongdoing. When I showed her specific examples of the evidence I had gathered, including financial records that documented the flow of money from industry sources to her campaign and recorded conversations that captured her discussing voting commitments with David Chen, Victoria's strategy shifted to minimizing the significance of her actions rather than denying them entirely. She argued that the activities I had documented were common practices in political campaigns, and that her behavior was consistent with standard fundraising and coalition-building activities. Victoria claimed that she had never explicitly agreed to vote in specific ways in exchange for campaign contributions, and that any correlation between her voting record and contributor interests was coincidental rather than the result of corrupt arrangements. She insisted that her legislative decisions had been based on careful consideration of policy merits and constituent interests, rather than obligations to campaign contributors, even though the evidence clearly showed otherwise. As the conversation continued, Victoria became increasingly emotional and defensive, alternating between anger at my investigation and appeals to family loyalty that she argued should prevent me from publishing a story that would damage her career. She accused me of jealousy and resentment about her political success and suggested that my motivation for investigating her was personal rather than professional. She argued that I was betraying family obligations and destroying relationships that should be more important than any journalistic story. The accusation of jealousy was particularly painful because it echoed doubts I had struggled with throughout the investigation about whether my motivation was truly professional or whether I was unconsciously seeking to undermine Victoria's success. However, the evidence I had gathered was objective and undeniable, and my obligation to report on political corruption was not diminished by the fact that the corruption involved a family member rather than a stranger. Victoria's final appeal was to the potential consequences of publication for our parents and extended family members who had invested emotionally and financially in her political career. She argued that exposing her corruption would devastate people who had done nothing wrong and who deserved protection from the consequences of her mistakes. She suggested that I could serve the public interest by reporting on other aspects of the corruption network while protecting our family from unnecessary harm. The appeal to family loyalty was emotionally powerful, but it could not override my professional obligation to report the truth about Victoria's activities. The voters who had been deceived by her false campaign promises deserved to know about her corruption, and the democratic institutions that had been undermined by her actions deserve protection through accountability and transparency. Publishing the story would be personally painful, but failing to publish it would represent a betrayal of journalistic principles and public trust. The dinner conversation lasted nearly 4 hours and ended without resolution or agreement about how to proceed. Victoria left angry and upset, clearly understanding that I intended to publish the story regardless of her objections or appeals. I left feeling emotionally drained but professionally confident that I was making the right decision based on evidence and ethical obligations rather than personal considerations or family pressure. Over the following days, I completed my investigation by conducting final interviews with sources and reviewing the evidence one last time to ensure accuracy and completeness. I also consulted with editors and legal counsel to ensure that the story would meet professional standards and withstand any legal challenges that Victoria or other implicated parties might pursue after publication. The story I ultimately published was comprehensive and damaging, documenting Victoria's extensive participation in the corruption network and her systematic betrayal of the campaign promises that had earned her voters' trust and support. The evidence was presented clearly and objectively, with appropriate context about the broader corruption scheme and its implications for democratic governance and electoral integrity. The weeks following my confrontational dinner with Victoria were marked by an eerie calm that felt more ominous than reassuring. I had expected Victoria to contact me with additional arguments against publication, threats of legal action, or attempts to negotiate some form of compromise that might minimize the damage to her career and our family relationships. Instead, she seemed to have retreated into a defensive silence that suggested she was developing strategies for managing the crisis that would inevitably follow publication of my story. My investigation had reached the point where I had sufficient evidence to publish a comprehensive exposé of the corruption network and Victoria's role within it. The documentation was thorough, the sources were credible, and the legal review had confirmed that the story would meet professional standards for accuracy and fairness. However, I was struggling with the timing and approach for publication, knowing that once the story appeared, there would be no possibility of repairing the damage to family relationships or protecting innocent people from the consequences of Victoria's choices. The personal cost of my investigation was becoming increasingly apparent as I contemplated the aftermath of publication. My parents had dedicated years of their lives to supporting Victoria's political career, making financial sacrifices and emotional investments that would be devastated by revelations of her corruption. Extended family members who had celebrated Victoria's success and felt proud of her achievements would be humiliated by the exposure of her illegal activities and betrayal of public trust. I was also concerned about the professional consequences for people who had worked on Victoria's campaign or in her legislative office without knowledge of her corrupt activities. Honest staff members and volunteers who had believed in Victoria's message and dedicated their time and energy to her success would be tarred by association with her corruption, potentially damaging their own career prospects and reputations in ways that they did not deserve. Despite these concerns, I remained convinced that publication was necessary and appropriate, given the evidence I had gathered and the public interest in exposing political corruption. The democratic system depends on accountability and transparency, and allowing corruption to continue unchecked would ultimately cause more harm than exposing it and dealing with the immediate consequences. The voters who had been deceived deserved to know the truth, and other politicians needed to understand that corrupt behavior would be exposed and punished. My editors at the Tribune were supportive of the investigation and committed to publishing the story, despite its potential impact on local political relationships and the newspaper's access to government sources. The story represented exactly the kind of investigative journalism that newspapers are supposed to provide, and the evidence was strong enough to withstand any challenges or criticism that might follow publication. The newspaper's legal counsel had reviewed the story thoroughly and confirmed that it met all professional and legal standards for accuracy and fairness. The timing of publication became a strategic consideration as I worked with editors to determine when the story would have maximum impact and serve the public interest most effectively. Publishing during the legislative session would ensure that the corruption revelations could influence pending legislation and prevent further damage to the democratic process. However, publishing during a less active news period might ensure that the story received adequate attention and analysis rather than being overshadowed by other political developments. I ultimately decided that the story should be published as soon as possible to minimize the time that Victoria and other implicated parties would have to develop defensive strategies or attempt to discredit my reporting. The evidence was solid and the story was ready for publication, so any delay would serve no legitimate purpose, while potentially allowing corrupt activities to continue, or giving wrongdoers time to destroy evidence or intimidate sources. The final week before publication was consumed with fact-checking, legal review, and coordination with editors about presentation and follow-up coverage. The story was complex and extensive, requiring careful organization and clear writing to ensure that readers could understand the evidence and its implications without being overwhelmed by technical details about campaign finance laws and regulatory procedures. The goal was to produce a story that would be accessible to general readers, while providing sufficient detail to satisfy experts and critics who would scrutinize every aspect of the reporting. I also spent time during this period preparing for the personal and professional consequences that would follow publication. I knew that Victoria would likely attempt to discredit my reporting by questioning my motivations and suggesting that family resentment had influenced my investigation. I prepared responses to potential criticisms and gathered additional documentation that would support my conclusions if they were challenged by Victoria or her supporters. The emotional preparation for publication was more difficult than the professional preparation. I knew that the story would end my relationship with Victoria, and probably with my parents, who would view my investigation as a betrayal of family loyalty rather than a fulfillment of journalistic responsibility. I was prepared for this outcome intellectually, but the prospect of losing relationships that had been central to my identity since childhood was emotionally devastating, even when I knew it was necessary. I also struggled with guilt about the timing of my investigation and the way I had gathered evidence about Victoria's activities. I had used my position as her sister to gain access to information and insights that would not have been available to other journalists, and I wondered whether I had violated trust and family obligations in ways that went beyond what professional duty required. The ethical complexity of investigating a family member was not adequately addressed by standard journalistic guidelines, and I was forced to rely on my own judgment about appropriate boundaries and procedures. The decision to give Victoria one final opportunity to comment on the story before publication was both a professional obligation and a personal gesture that acknowledged our family relationship. I sent her a detailed summary of the allegations and evidence that would be included in the story, along with a request for any response or additional information she wanted to provide. The communication was formal and professional, but it represented my last attempt to maintain some form of dialogue before publication made any reconciliation impossible. Victoria's response to my final outreach was swift and angry. She accused me of conducting a biased investigation that was motivated by personal jealousy rather than legitimate journalistic purpose. She denied all allegations of corruption and threatened legal action if I published what she characterized as false and defamatory accusations. She also made personal appeals to family loyalty and suggested that I was destroying relationships and hurting innocent people for the sake of advancing my own career at her expense. The response confirmed my assessment that Victoria had no intention of acknowledging her corrupt activities or taking responsibility for her betrayal of public trust. She was committed to a defensive strategy that would involve attacking my credibility and motivations rather than addressing the evidence I had gathered. This approach would likely prolong the controversy and increase the damage to our family relationships, but it was consistent with the patterns of deception and manipulation that had characterized her political career. The final decision to proceed with publication was made during a meeting with my editors that took place 3 days before our family's annual Christmas dinner. The timing was unfortunate, but unavoidable given the news cycle and the need to publish the story while the legislative session was still active. The story would appear on the newspaper's website and in print editions just days before our family gathering, ensuring that the revelations would dominate what was supposed to be a celebration of family relationships and holiday traditions. I realized that the Christmas dinner would provide an opportunity for a final confrontation with Victoria in front of our extended family, potentially offering a chance for honest dialogue about her corrupt activities and their consequences for everyone involved. The setting would be emotionally charged and potentially explosive, but it might also create conditions for truth-telling and accountability that would not be possible in more formal or private settings. The prospect of using our family's Christmas dinner as a venue for exposing Victoria's corruption was deeply troubling, but the alternative of allowing her to continue deceiving our family while maintaining her public facade seemed even more problematic. The truth about her activities would come out eventually through my published story, and giving our family an opportunity to hear the allegations directly from me, rather than learning about them through media coverage, might actually be a kindness, rather than a cruelty. As I prepared for what I knew would be the most difficult family gathering of my life, I felt a mixture of dread and determination that reflected the complexity of my situation. I was about to destroy relationships that had been central to my identity, while fulfilling professional obligations that I believed were essential to democratic accountability and public trust. The personal cost would be enormous, but the alternative of remaining silent about corruption would represent a betrayal of principles that were equally central to who I was and what I believed. Christmas morning at my parents' house in Denver carried all the familiar warmth and chaos that had marked our family celebrations for decades. The smell of my mother's cinnamon rolls filled the kitchen. My father was already adjusting the thermostat for the third time before noon, and relatives were arriving with casserole dishes and wrapped presents that would transform our modest living room into a festive gathering space. Under normal circumstances, I would have felt grateful for the comfort of tradition and the joy of family togetherness. Instead, I carried the weight of knowledge that would shatter the illusion of harmony and change our family dynamics forever. Victoria arrived fashionably late, as had become her custom since winning election to the state senate. She swept through the front door wearing a burgundy wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent, followed by 2 staffers who helped carry gift bags and a small security detail that waited discreetly outside. Her entrance had the practiced timing of someone accustomed to making impressive arrivals, and the family members already gathered in the living room immediately shifted their attention to Colorado's rising political star. The transformation in Victoria's public persona over the past year had been remarkable to witness. The earnest young woman who had campaigned on transparency and fighting corruption had evolved into a polished politician who commanded attention and deference wherever she appeared. She moved through the family gathering with the confidence of someone who expected admiration and received it automatically, pausing for selfies with cousins and offering updates on legislative initiatives that made her sound both important and relatable. My parents beamed with pride as Victoria held court in their living room, discussing her committee assignments and upcoming policy priorities with relatives who hung on every word. My father had printed copies of recent newspaper articles featuring Victoria, and he distributed them to family members who might have missed her latest media appearances. My mother had prepared Victoria's favorite dishes and arranged the seating to ensure that she would be the natural center of attention during dinner. The extended family that gathered for our Christmas celebration included my father's brother Mark and his family, my mother's sister Patricia with her husband and teenage children, and several cousins who had driven in from Colorado Springs and Fort Collins to participate in what had become an annual tradition. These were good people who worked as teachers, mechanics, nurses, and small business owners, people who took pride in their connection to Victoria's political success, and who genuinely believed that her achievements reflected well on the entire family. I spent the morning making polite conversation and helping with meal preparation, while struggling internally with the knowledge of what I would reveal before the day ended. The evidence of Victoria's corruption was safely stored in my car, organized in a folder that contained bank records, email printouts, and transcripts of recorded conversations that would demolish her carefully constructed public image and devastate everyone who had invested emotionally in her political career. The casual conversations that filled the hours before dinner took on an almost surreal quality as family members discussed Victoria's bright political future and speculated about her potential candidacy for higher office. My cousin Sarah mentioned that her friends at work were excited about having a personal connection to someone who might run for Congress someday. My Uncle Mark talked about how proud he was to tell his golf buddies that his niece was a state senator who was fighting for working families and government accountability. The irony of these conversations was almost unbearable. Knowing what I knew about Victoria's actual activities and the betrayal of public trust that her political success represented. These family members had genuine pride in Victoria's achievements and sincere belief in her integrity, and I was about to destroy both their pride and their illusions in the most public and painful way possible. The knowledge that I was carrying felt like a physical weight that made normal conversation almost impossible to maintain. Victoria seemed relaxed and confident throughout the morning, showing no apparent awareness that her secret activities had been discovered or that her political career was about to be destroyed. She discussed upcoming legislation with the authority of someone who genuinely believed in her own integrity, and she accepted family members' congratulations and praise with the gracious manner of someone who felt deserving of admiration and respect. The disconnect between Victoria's public persona and her actual behavior was stark and disturbing. She had become so skilled at compartmentalizing her corrupt activities that she could maintain her facade of integrity even in intimate family settings where pretense should have been unnecessary. The ease with which she deceived people who loved her demonstrated a level of moral corruption that went beyond simple financial misconduct to encompass fundamental dishonesty about her character and values. My mother spent most of the morning coordinating meal preparation and ensuring that everything would be perfect for what she clearly viewed as a celebration of Victoria's continued political success. She had prepared place cards that would seat Victoria at the head of the table, and she had planned the menu around dishes that would accommodate Victoria's dietary preferences and schedule constraints. The effort and attention to detail reflected her genuine love for Victoria and her pride in having raised a daughter who had achieved such remarkable success. The preparations felt like watching someone arrange decorations for a party that would never happen, knowing that the celebration would be replaced by confrontation, and the pride would be replaced by shame and disappointment. I wanted to warn my mother about what was coming, but I also knew that the shock and devastation would be equally intense, regardless of whether she was prepared for it or caught completely off guard. My father spent the morning playing host and political commentator, discussing current events with relatives, and providing insider perspectives on state politics that he had gleaned from Victoria's conversations and media appearances. He clearly enjoyed having access to political information and connections that impressed his family and friends, and he took obvious pride in his role as the father of an elected official who was making a difference in state government. The political discussions that my father initiated provided opportunities for family members to express their support for Victoria's policy positions and their hope that she would continue advancing progressive causes that aligned with their own values and priorities. These conversations reinforced the genuine belief that Victoria was fighting for principles and people, rather than serving her own interests and those of her corrupt contributors. As the afternoon progressed and dinner preparation intensified, I found myself struggling with last-minute doubts about the wisdom and morality of exposing Victoria's corruption in front of our extended family. The revelation would devastate innocent people who had done nothing wrong and who deserved protection from the consequences of Victoria's choices. The timing and setting seemed unnecessarily cruel, and I wondered whether there might be alternative approaches that would serve the public interest while minimizing harm to family relationships. However, I also recognized that any alternative approach would likely be less effective at achieving accountability and preventing further corruption. Victoria had demonstrated through our previous confrontation that she was committed to denial and deception, rather than acknowledgement and responsibility. A private revelation would give her time to develop defensive strategies and potentially continue her corrupt activities, while maintaining her public facade of integrity. The family gathering represented Victoria's base of emotional and financial support, the people whose belief in her integrity provided the foundation for her political success and public credibility. If these family members understood the truth about her activities, they would be less likely to continue enabling her corruption through their emotional support and less likely to be deceived by her future political campaigns and public statements. As we transitioned from afternoon socializing to evening dinner preparation, I made the final decision to proceed with my planned revelation. The evidence was undeniable, the public interest was clear, and the alternative of allowing Victoria to continue deceiving our family while betraying public trust was more problematic than the immediate pain that truth-telling would cause. The family deserved to know who Victoria really was, even if that knowledge would be devastating and permanently alter our relationships. The formal dinner that my mother had planned would provide the appropriate setting for a serious discussion about Victoria's activities and their implications for everyone involved. The gathering would ensure that all family members heard the same information simultaneously, preventing Victoria from developing different explanations for different audiences, and ensuring that everyone could participate in the discussion about how to respond to the revelations. I retrieved the folder of evidence from my car as family members gathered in the dining room for what they expected would be a celebration of family togetherness and Victoria's continued political success. The documents felt heavy in my hands, not just because of their physical weight, but because of their potential to destroy relationships and shatter illusions that had provided comfort and meaning for people I loved. The dining room had been transformed into an elegant setting that reflected my mother's determination to create a memorable celebration worthy of Victoria's political status and our family's pride in her achievements. The table was set with my grandmother's china and crystal glasses that only appeared for the most special occasions, and centerpieces of winter greenery and candles created an atmosphere of warmth and sophistication. The careful attention to detail demonstrated how important this gathering was to my parents and how much they wanted to honor Victoria's success. Victoria took her designated seat at the head of the table with the natural authority of someone accustomed to being the center of attention and admiration. She looked radiant in a cream-colored blouse that conveyed both professionalism and approachability, and her manner suggested complete confidence in her position as the family's political star and moral leader. She had no apparent awareness that her carefully constructed image was about to be demolished by evidence of systematic corruption that contradicted everything she claimed to represent. The dinner conversation began with the usual family updates and holiday pleasantries that preceded more serious discussions about politics and current events. My cousin Sarah shared news about her recent promotion at the engineering firm where she worked. My uncle Mark discussed his plans for retirement and travel, and my Aunt Patricia provided updates on her children's academic achievements and college plans. The conversations were warm and genuine, reflecting the strong relationships and mutual affection that had always characterized our family gatherings. As the main course was served and wine glasses were filled, the conversation naturally shifted to Victoria's political activities and legislative priorities. Family members asked informed questions about specific bills and policy initiatives, demonstrating their genuine interest in her work and their pride in having insider access to state government through their connection to an elected official. Victoria responded with detailed explanations that showcased her knowledge and commitment, while reinforcing her image as a principled advocate for progressive causes. The political discussion provided opportunities for family members to express their support for Victoria's public positions on affordable housing, environmental protection, and government transparency. My father mentioned how proud he was when Victoria's speeches were covered in the local media, and my mother shared stories about friends and neighbors who had complimented her on raising such an impressive daughter. The expressions of pride and admiration were genuine and heartfelt, making what I was about to do feel even more devastating. Victoria accepted the praise and congratulations with gracious humility that seemed authentic and appropriate. She acknowledged the family support that had made her political success possible, and expressed gratitude for the encouragement and assistance that had helped her overcome challenges and achieve her goals. Her comments reinforced the narrative that her political career was a family success story that reflected well on everyone involved. As dessert was served and the conversation reached its most relaxed and celebratory tone, I made the decision that would change everything for everyone at the table. I stood up slowly, ensuring that I had everyone's attention, and announced that I had something important to share with the family about Victoria's political activities. The sudden shift in tone was immediately apparent, and family members looked puzzled and concerned about why I would interrupt a celebratory dinner with what sounded like serious business. Victoria's reaction was immediate and telling. Her expression shifted from relaxed confidence to alert wariness as she recognized that I was about to reveal information that she preferred to keep hidden. She attempted to deflect my announcement by suggesting that political discussions could wait until after dinner, but her obvious discomfort confirmed that she understood exactly what I was preparing to disclose. I began by explaining that my work as an investigative journalist had led me to discover evidence of systematic corruption in state government that involved multiple legislators and significant amounts of illegal campaign contributions. I emphasized that the information I was about to share was based on thorough research and verified documentation rather than speculation or rumor. The formal tone and serious manner helped establish that this was not a casual political discussion, but a revelation of criminal activity that had serious implications for everyone involved. The family members listened with growing concern and confusion as I outlined the general structure of the corruption network that I had investigated, explaining how shell organizations were used to disguise the true sources of campaign contributions, and how legislators made specific voting commitments in exchange for financial support. The complexity of the arrangements required careful explanation to ensure that everyone understood the mechanics of the corruption and why it represented a betrayal of democratic principles and public trust. When I revealed that Victoria was not only aware of the corruption network, but was one of its most active and successful participants, the silence in the dining room was complete and profound. Family members stared at me in disbelief, then turned to look at Victoria for denial or explanation that would restore their faith in her integrity. Victoria's failure to immediately and convincingly deny the allegations created a vacuum that filled with growing anxiety and confusion. I began presenting specific evidence from the folder I had brought, starting with bank records that documented the flow of money from energy industry sources through shell organizations to Victoria's campaign account. The financial transactions were complex but traceable, and the amounts involved were substantial enough to demonstrate that this was not a case of minor technical violations, but systematic corruption involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. Victoria's first attempt at damage control was to question the authenticity of the documents and suggest that they might have been fabricated by political opponents who wanted to damage her reputation. She argued that financial records could be manipulated, and that the allegations were part of a coordinated attack designed to undermine her effectiveness as a progressive voice in state government. Her defensive strategy demonstrated that she had anticipated exposure and prepared responses designed to discredit evidence rather than address its substance. My Uncle Mark, who had experience in accounting and financial analysis, examined the bank records carefully and confirmed their apparent authenticity and significance. He pointed out specific details in the documentation that would be difficult to fabricate and explained how the transactions revealed patterns consistent with deliberate money laundering rather than legitimate political contributions. His professional assessment undermined Victoria's claims that the evidence might be fraudulent or misleading. I continued presenting evidence by playing portions of recorded conversations that captured Victoria discussing specific voting commitments with her campaign manager, David Chen. The recordings were clear and unambiguous, featuring Victoria's voice, acknowledging arrangements with contributors, and confirming her understanding of what was expected in return for their financial support. The audio evidence eliminated any possibility that the corruption allegations were based on misunderstandings or misinterpretations of legitimate political activities. Victoria's reaction to hearing her own voice confirming corrupt arrangements was desperate and increasingly hostile. She accused me of illegally recording private conversations and suggested that the audio had been edited or taken out of context to create false impressions of criminal activity. She argued that campaign strategy discussions were being mischaracterized as evidence of corruption, and that my investigation was biased and unprofessional. The family members who listened to the recorded conversations were clearly shocked and disturbed by what they heard. My cousin Sarah asked direct questions about specific statements Victoria had made, and my Aunt Patricia expressed confusion about how the Victoria on the recordings could be the same person who had just been discussing her commitment to government transparency and ethical leadership. The cognitive dissonance was apparent and painful for everyone trying to reconcile the evidence with their beliefs about Victoria's character. I presented additional evidence showing how Victoria's voting record as a state senator had consistently aligned with the interests of her corrupt contributors rather than the progressive principles she had campaigned on. The pattern was clear and comprehensive, demonstrating that her legislative decisions had been determined by financial obligations to special interests rather than consideration of policy merits or constituent needs. The accumulation of evidence created an undeniable picture of systematic corruption that had compromised Victoria's integrity as an elected official and betrayed the trust of voters who had supported her based on false promises and deceptive campaign messaging. The documentation was thorough and compelling, leaving no reasonable doubt about Victoria's participation in illegal activities that had enriched her campaign while serving the interests of wealthy contributors rather than ordinary citizens. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.